Welcome to Egopedia. Have you ever felt desperate to be understood, yet find it hard to truly listen? In this video, we explore the silent contradiction behind wanting empathy without offering it, a reflection for those often called selfish and those brave enough to ask why.
I want to be understood, but I never want to listen. Reflections for those often considered selfish. This article explores the psychological paradox wherein individuals yearn for understanding and empathy from others while simultaneously resisting the reciprocal act of listening. Framed within the broader discourse on selfishness, emotional maturity, and interpersonal dynamics, this reflection investigates the roots, expressions, and consequences of such behavior. Drawing from cognitive psychology, communication theory, and social behavior studies, the article outlines how unmet needs, emotional insecurity, and ego defense mechanisms contribute to this dynamic. It also provides reflective strategies for cultivating self-awareness, active listening, and reciprocal empathy to foster healthier relationships. The statement, "I want to be understood, but I never want to listen," captures a common yet rarely examined inner conflict. It is a sentiment that many unconsciously live out, a deep craving to be seen, heard, and validated, coupled with resistance, sometimes even hostility, toward offering the same in return. People displaying this behavior are frequently labeled as selfish, self-absorbed, or narcissistic. But is the root cause truly selfishness, or is it something deeper, something more human? This article aims to unpack the emotional and psychological dimensions of this pattern and offer a pathway to greater self-awareness for individuals caught in this paradox. We argue that this phenomenon is less about malice and more about unmet emotional needs, fear of vulnerability, and underdeveloped empathy. The psychology behind the paradox. At the heart of the paradox, "I want to be understood, but I never want to listen," lies a complex interplay between emotional needs, cognitive biases, and ego-based defense mechanisms. This section explores three critical psychological underpinnings: the universal human need for validation, the fear-based resistance to vulnerability, and the role of ego in shaping interpersonal behavior. The universal need to be understood. Understanding is a form of psychological oxygen. According to humanistic psychology, particularly the work of Carl Rogers, the need for unconditional positive regard and empathic understanding is central to human development and emotional well-being. When a person feels understood, they experience psychological safety, a sense that their identity, emotions, and perspectives are valid and accepted. This need originates in early childhood. Children seek mirrored responses from caregivers. When a child cries, they look to a parent not just for a solution but for acknowledgement of their distress. When these needs are consistently met, a foundation of secure attachment is formed. However, when children experience frequent emotional invalidation, such as being told to stop crying or get over it, they may grow into adults with an unmet craving for empathy and a hypersensitivity to being misunderstood. This unmet need doesn't disappear. Instead, it often becomes amplified in adulthood, surfacing as a repeated emotional pattern: the compulsion to explain oneself, overtalk, dominate conversations, or seek sympathy while dismissing or ignoring the perspectives of others. These are not signs of selfishness per se, but rather echoes of emotional deprivation. Listening as a threat to the ego. Listening, especially deep, non-defensive listening, is not a passive activity. It is an act of vulnerability and humility. It requires setting aside one's own perspective temporarily to make room for another's emotional reality. This is where the paradox intensifies. Many individuals, especially those with fragile self-concepts, perceive listening as a threat rather than a skill. Here's why. Listening requires temporary ego suspension. To truly understand someone, one must suppress the immediate impulse to correct, judge, or relate everything back to the self. For those with a strong attachment to their own narratives or a fear of being wrong, this ego suspension can feel intolerable. Fear of invalidation. Some individuals associate listening with the possibility of hearing uncomfortable truths, criticisms, unmet expectations, or emotional pain. Rather than risk facing these realities, They block incoming perspectives altogether, preferring the safety of monologue over the unpredictability of dialogue. Control dynamics. Listening shifts the locus of control. When you listen, you're no longer directing the conversation. You are receiving it. For individuals who equate control with safety, this loss of dominance can feel deeply destabilizing. This defensive posture is often unconscious. The person might not realize they are avoiding listening. Instead, they may rationalize their behavior with statements like, "People don't make sense," or "Nobody listens to me, so why should I listen to them?" Cognitive biases that reinforce the imbalance. Several well-documented cognitive biases also reinforce this paradox. Egocentric bias, the tendency to overestimate the importance of one's own perspective. It leads people to believe their emotions or experiences are more significant than those of others. Confirmation bias. People naturally seek information that affirms their beliefs and reject or avoid viewpoints that challenge them. Listening with openness risks disrupting mental comfort zones. Fundamental attribution error. We tend to justify our own lack of listening as circumstantial. "I was tired. They weren't making sense," but view others' failure to listen as a character flaw. "They're selfish. They don't care about me." These biases create a self-reinforcing loop. The more one fails to listen, the more one feels misunderstood. The more misunderstood one feels, the less willing they become to listen. Emotional exhaustion and the empathy budget. There's also a practical, emotional dimension at play, the concept of an empathy budget. Everyone has a limited capacity for emotional labor. People who feel chronically emotionally depleted, whether from work, caregiving, trauma, or past relationship dynamics, may become emotionally frugal, choosing to conserve empathy for themselves. Ironically, those most desperate to be heard are often the least emotionally available to others. Not out of malice, but because they're running on emotional fumes. The result is an empathy imbalance where conversations become one-sided, with one person doing all the emoting and the other doing all the absorbing, until, eventually, they disengage. To summarize, the paradox of wanting to be understood without offering the same in return is not rooted solely in selfishness. It's more accurately viewed as the outcome of three interwoven dynamics. 1. A deep, possibly unhealed emotional need to be seen and validated. 2. A fear-based resistance to vulnerability and ego deflation. 3. The presence of cognitive distortions and emotional exhaustion that justify self-focused communication. By understanding these underpinnings, individuals can begin to break the cycle, not through shame or self-condemnation, but through self-compassion and conscious effort to grow. Selfishness or self-protection. At first glance, people who constantly demand attention but rarely reciprocate may appear categorically selfish, wrapped up in their own world, indifferent to others, and emotionally unavailable. But beneath this appearance often lies a more nuanced psychological reality. What seems like selfishness may actually be a form of emotional self-protection rooted in past pain, survival strategies, and unprocessed vulnerability. This section explores the distinction between selfishness as a moral failing and self-protection as an adaptive, though maladaptive, psychological strategy. It asks, what drives someone to shut out others' perspectives while demanding constant emotional engagement? What internal structures maintain this imbalance? And how can understanding these mechanisms reframe our judgment of these individuals and of ourselves when we fall into the same pattern? Redefining selfishness. The term selfish typically carries a heavy moral judgment. It suggests a person who willfully disregards the needs of others in pursuit of personal gain. However, much of what is labeled as selfish behavior in interpersonal dynamics is not always intentional, nor is it inherently malicious. In psychology, especially in trauma-informed frameworks, behavior is increasingly viewed through a lens of adaptation rather than character flaw. What looks like a self-centered refusal to listen might actually be a dysregulated nervous system reacting to emotional overload, a protective behavioral script developed in response to childhood invalidation, a habitual survival strategy to avoid emotional confrontation or perceived rejection. Seen through this lens, many selfish people are not acting out of entitlement or greed, but out of emotional scarcity. They may be operating in a constant state of psychological threat, interpreting any demand for empathy as a depletion of already limited emotional resources. The armor of emotional self-protection. Self-protection is the armor worn by those who have been emotionally wounded. For individuals who feel unsafe being emotionally available, self-focus becomes a shield. The logic is simple if unconscious. If I stay in control of the conversation, I won't be exposed. If I keep the attention on me, I don't have to deal with other people's pain. If I only express but never absorb, I won't be overwhelmed. This isn't selfishness in the traditional sense, it's emotional rationing. The person may be so consumed by their own unacknowledged needs that they can't fathom holding space for someone else's reality. In this way, emotional self-protection mimics selfishness, but the driver is fear, not egotism. Common signs of emotional self-protection that resemble selfishness include deflecting conversations away from others and back to oneself, interrupting or invalidating others to preserve one's own narrative, avoiding vulnerability by changing topics when emotions rise, using intellectualism or humor to create emotional distance, cultural and social reinforcement. It's also important to recognize how cultural and social systems often reward the very behaviors that appear selfish. In individualistic cultures, traits like assertiveness, self-promotion, and emotional independence are not only normalized, they're celebrated. People are encouraged to speak their truth, stand out, and prioritize self-care, all of which are valuable principles, but can easily become distorted into self-preoccupation when unbalanced by empathy and interpersonal awareness. Social media further exacerbates this phenomenon by creating platforms where self-expression is prioritized over mutual exchange. The algorithmic design rewards broadcasting, not listening. As a result, people may unconsciously adopt one-sided relational habits, believing they are engaging meaningfully while never actually listening or connecting. Over time, these cultural forces can normalize behaviors that, in close personal relationships, feel deeply isolating to others. Trauma, neglect, and emotional scarcity. Many individuals who struggle to listen or connect empathically come from environments marked by neglect or emotional abuse, unpredictable caregivers, chaotic or conditional love, a lack of attunement to emotional needs. In such environments, the child learns that their own survival depends on securing attention, often by becoming louder, more dramatic, or more emotionally urgent. They may also learn that other people's emotions are dangerous or irrelevant, particularly if listening in the past meant absorbing someone else's rage, guilt, or pain without support. As adults, these individuals may default to self-centered communication not because they are unaware of others, but because they have never experienced emotional relationships as safe or mutual. This pattern is common among people with traits associated with insecure attachment styles, particularly anxious preoccupied or dismissive avoidant, complex PTSD, CPTSD, borderline or narcissistic tendencies, which are often trauma-related. Understanding this doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it contextualizes it, opening a door for healing rather than shame. The irony of emotional isolation. The most tragic irony is this: the very people who crave understanding the most, who long to be seen, heard, and validated, often push others away through the very strategies meant to protect themselves. Their insistence on being the center of attention, their inability to reciprocate empathy, and their emotional defensiveness often erode the trust and emotional intimacy they so desperately want. Over time, this creates a pattern of emotional isolation. 1. The person demands understanding but refuses to listen. 2. Others feel drained, unseen, or emotionally unsafe and withdraw. 3. The person interprets this withdrawal as rejection or misunderstanding. 4. Their sense of being alone intensifies, reinforcing their defensive stance. This cycle becomes self-perpetuating unless the individual becomes conscious of their role in it. Reframing the behavior, from judgment to compassionate accountability. Rather than labeling individuals as selfish and leaving it at that, we must adopt a dual approach that combines compassion with accountability. Compassion says, This behavior likely comes from pain, not malice. Let's understand the origin. Accountability says, regardless of where it comes from, this behavior hurts others. It needs to change. This reframing encourages self-reflection without shame, allowing the person to acknowledge their behavior and its consequences while also exploring the emotional wounds that may be driving it. The dynamic of wanting to be understood without listening is not always the result of selfishness. More often, it is the product of emotional scarcity and unmet needs, protective adaptations developed in childhood, cultural reinforcements of one-sided communication, a lack of relational models for mutual empathy. Understanding the why behind the behavior is the first step in changing it. The goal is not just to listen better or be less selfish, but to heal enough to feel safe in the vulnerability of mutual understanding. The cost of one-way empathy. Empathy is a bridge, a dynamic, reciprocal act that connects individuals across emotional and psychological distances. But when empathy flows in only one direction, the bridge becomes strained, and eventually, it may collapse. One-way empathy, where one person consistently receives emotional attention without reciprocating, incurs a high cost, both for the empathizer and for the relational ecosystem as a whole. This section explores the emotional, relational, psychological, and even societal toll of imbalanced empathy. While the focus often falls on the person who fails to listen, the hidden suffering of those who do listen, often silently, habitually, and without acknowledgement, deserves deeper examination. Emotional exhaustion, the listener's silent burnout. Empathy is not infinite. Like any emotional resource, it requires rest, replenishment, and reciprocity to remain sustainable. When one person becomes the designated listener in a relationship, whether as a partner, friend, parent, or colleague, they are often expected to absorb emotional content without expectation of being heard themselves. Over time, this leads to emotional exhaustion, marked by compassion fatigue, a state where the ability to care diminishes because emotional output exceeds emotional input. Resentment buildup, unacknowledged feelings of being used, taken for granted, or emotionally depleted. Identity erosion, a sense that one's own voice, needs, or boundaries are invisible or unimportant. People in this role often suffer quietly, believing that voicing their discomfort would make them selfish or unkind. Ironically, they may begin to mirror the very behavior they resent, closing off, withdrawing, or becoming emotionally unavailable, not out of cruelty, but from survival. Breakdown of relational trust. Trust in any relationship hinges on mutuality, the belief that both parties are equally invested in seeing and supporting each other. One-way empathy creates a power imbalance where one person becomes the emotional caretaker, while the other becomes the emotional dependent or consumer. This imbalance often results in communication breakdowns. The empathizer may stop sharing openly, knowing their words will be redirected or dismissed. Surface-level interactions. Emotional depth is replaced by performative check-ins or transactional conversations. Relational fragility. When the empathizer finally sets a boundary, it can trigger confusion or defensiveness in the other party, leading to conflict or rupture. Over time, even once close relationships can deteriorate into functional arrangements, where people stay connected out of duty, habit, or fear, rather than emotional intimacy. Identity dissonance and the helper's trap. Many empathizers derive a sense of identity and worth from their ability to support others. While this can be noble, it can also become a trap, especially in codependent dynamics or situations where self-worth is conditional upon being the strong one or the good listener. This leads to identity dissonance where individuals suppress their own needs to maintain the role of the helper, struggle to ask for support, fearing they will be seen as weak or needy, remain in emotionally draining relationships because they confuse self-abandonment with virtue. Eventually, the disconnect between outward empathy and inward depletion can lead to anxiety, depression, or a sense of existential emptiness. If I'm always there for everyone else, who is there for me? Enabling narcissistic or entitled behaviors. Another hidden cost of one-way empathy is enabling. When someone continually receives emotional validation without being held accountable for their lack of reciprocity, they may develop entitled relational habits, expecting others to always listen, accommodate, or prioritize their emotions. A low emotional self-awareness, relying on others to process their feelings rather than learning to self-regulate. Narcissistic tendencies, viewing relationships through a lens of utility, valuing people for what they provide emotionally, not for who they are. In this way, well-meaning empathy can unintentionally fuel emotional immaturity. The more someone is shielded from the consequences of their one-sidedness, the less incentive they have to grow. Emotional absenteeism. When the empathizer finally disengages, there comes a tipping point in one-way empathy dynamics. The empathizer, having given endlessly, may reach an emotional threshold where they simply stop caring, not out of cruelty, but as an act of psychological self-preservation. Signs of emotional absenteeism include a listening but no longer emotionally investing, offering polite but hollow responses, feeling numb, indifferent, or quietly hostile, fantasizing about escape or disconnection. This withdrawal can be deeply confusing to the other party, who may feel blindsided. What happened? Why did you stop being there for me? Without realizing that the relationship had long been operating on an empathy imbalance. In some cases, this leads to sudden relationship dissolution, where the empathizer ghosts or breaks contact entirely after years of silent emotional labor. Societal implications. The devaluation of listeners. Beyond the personal sphere, one-way empathy mirrors larger societal trends where loudness is rewarded over attentiveness and expression is prioritized over comprehension. In such cultures, the listener is often invisible, expected to be available, selfless, and emotionally competent without acknowledgement or support. Empathy is commodified, e.g., emotional labor, expected in service jobs or domestic roles, but rarely reciprocated or compensated. Emotional expression becomes a performance, not a conversation, contributing to increasing feelings of loneliness despite hyperconnectivity. This devaluation not only harms individuals, but also undermines collective empathy, a crucial ingredient in sustaining healthy communities, families, and institutions. One-way empathy extracts a heavy price from individuals and relationships alike. For the empathizer, it leads to burnout, resentment, and loss of self. For the receiver, it stunts emotional growth and fosters dependency. For the relationship, it corrodes trust and intimacy. For society, it amplifies disconnection under the guise of connection. Empathy must be reciprocal, respectful, and balanced to be truly transformative. Otherwise, it risks becoming a silent form of self-erasure, noble on the outside, but corrosive within. Pathways to growth. Recognizing the dynamics of one-way empathy is only the beginning. The true transformation lies in consciously choosing to evolve, whether you are the one who struggles to listen, the one who has been listening too much, or both. This section offers a roadmap for personal growth, emotional maturity, and relational repair. It does not promise perfection, but provides a framework to move from dysfunctional empathy patterns toward more mutual, life-giving relationships. The journey requires a mix of self-awareness, behavioral change, and often, therapeutic intervention. It involves confronting uncomfortable truths, dismantling protective ego structures, and learning to engage in relationships as both a giver and receiver of empathy. Cultivating self-awareness, recognizing the pattern in yourself. No transformation is possible without first acknowledging the existence of a pattern. If you often feel misunderstood but find it difficult or even unnecessary to truly listen to others, begin with introspection. Ask reflective questions. Oh, do I give others the space I demand for myself? Oh, am I truly present when others speak, or am I waiting for my turn to talk? Oh, do I feel discomfort when someone else is emotionally vulnerable? Observe conversational habits. Pay attention to how often you redirect conversations back to your own experiences or invalidate others' feelings, even subtly. These moments are not failures, they are feedback. Notice emotional triggers. Often, The inability to listen stems from unprocessed emotional pain. Does someone else's vulnerability make you feel unsafe? Does disagreement feel like rejection? Identifying your emotional flashpoints is key. Self-awareness is not about judgment. It's about developing the internal space to witness your reactions without automatically defending them. Rebuilding the skill of deep listening. Many people believe they're good listeners because they stay silent while someone else talks. But real listening, attuned, empathic, generous listening, is a cultivated skill. Key principles of deep listening include a presence over performance. Don't just wait for your turn to speak. Focus on understanding the person in front of you. Let go of rehearsing your response. Curiosity over control. Ask open-ended questions not to steer the conversation but to enter someone else's emotional world. What did that feel like for you? Can you say more about that? Validation over fixing. Many people interrupt not out of ego, but from a desire to solve or rescue. But often, what others need is not a solution, just to be heard, seen, and believed. Learn to say things like, "Oh, that makes sense." "Oh, it sounds like that was really hard." "Oh, thank you for sharing that with me." This type of listening is not natural for everyone, especially for those raised in emotionally chaotic or dismissive environments. But it can be relearned, one conversation at a time, releasing control and the need to be understood first. Many people demand to be understood before they are willing to listen. But mutual empathy does not work on a first-come, first-served basis. Growth requires releasing the belief that your voice must be prioritized before you can consider another's. This involves decentering the ego. Recognize that your truth is valid, but not the only truth. This reframing can be humbling and liberating at once. Allowing silence. Sometimes, letting another person speak without immediately responding can teach you to tolerate the discomfort of not being in control of the narrative. Accepting emotional asymmetry. Not every interaction will be perfectly balanced. Sometimes, growth means giving empathy without needing it to be reciprocated immediately, but with the boundary that over time, mutuality must return. Letting go of the need to dominate the emotional space is one of the hardest and most important steps in healing from one-way empathy patterns. Setting boundaries as an over-listener. If you're the one who always listens, always supports, and always absorbs, growth may look like reclaiming space. This is not selfishness. It is emotional sustainability. Healthy boundary practices include naming your needs. "Oh, I want to be here for you, but I also need time to process my own feelings." "Oh, I've been listening a lot lately. Can we check in about how I'm doing too?" Limiting emotional overexposure. You don't need to be available 24/7. It is okay to say, "Oh, can we talk about this tomorrow when I have more energy?" "Oh, I'm feeling emotionally full right now. I need a pause." Expecting reciprocity. Start evaluating relationships not only by how much people need you, but by how much they also support you. This shift can be painful, as it may reveal who values your humanity and who only values your utility. Setting boundaries does not mean withdrawing love. It means loving yourself enough to remain whole within connection. Practicing vulnerable communication. To grow past one-way empathy, both parties must learn to speak vulnerably, to share not only frustrations but underlying emotions. This creates emotional safety and fosters mutual understanding. Vulnerable communication sounds like, "I realized I've been talking a lot and not checking in with you. How are you doing lately? When I'm not listened to, I feel invisible. But I'm scared to say that because I don't want to push you away. I love being someone you can talk to. I just wish it went both ways more often." These statements don't blame, they invite. They create space for dialogue instead of defense. If you're the one struggling to listen, vulnerable communication may involve acknowledging your limitations. Sometimes I tune out when people get emotional because I don't know how to respond. I want to get better at that. This kind of honesty can open the door to relational growth rather than shut it with shame. Seeking help when needed. Sometimes, the dynamics of one-way empathy are so deeply entrenched due to trauma, attachment wounds, or personality patterns that outside support is necessary. Therapy or coaching can help by unpacking emotional avoidance and fear of vulnerability, rewiring communication styles rooted in family systems, teaching boundary work and emotional regulation, creating a safe space to practice being both seen and hearing others. There is no shame in needing help. In fact, asking for help is often the first step toward breaking the very cycle of silence and isolation that one-way empathy perpetuates. Growth from one-way empathy patterns is not about becoming perfect listeners or perfectly balanced partners overnight. It's about moving, step by step, from emotional imbalance to emotional integrity, where empathy is shared, not hoarded, offered freely, not demanded, received humbly, not consumed. Whether you have spent your life talking but not listening or listening but never being heard, healing is possible. The path is not easy, but it is real, and it is worth walking. To want to be understood is profoundly human, but to refuse to listen is to deny others that same humanity. Growth lies in recognizing this contradiction and working through the discomfort that reciprocal understanding requires. When we learn to listen not just to words but to emotions, silences, and needs, we become not only better communicators but better versions of ourselves. True connection begins not with the need to be understood, but with the courage to understand, because empathy, like respect, is only real when it flows both ways.